Hello, everybody. I'm back again with the listeners for you. And the poet is Walt De La Mare. Children, he is a children's poet, right? So you see, he's an English poet and he's also a short story writer, a novelist. And he's actually best known for his, poem, The Listeners, which he has done for children, right? And he's also well known for a highly acclaimed selection of subtle psychological horror stories, amongst which some are Satan's Aunt and All Hallows. So he's born on 25th April 1873 in United Kingdom, London, and he died on 22nd June 1956 in United Kingdom. So he's awarded with a Carnegie Medal, and a little more about our poet, which is very important, I guess. That is the appearance of songs for childhood, which is introduced by De La Mare as a talented author of children's literature, again in which he produced collections of fiction and verses and several highly praised anthologies. Right, so his writings in his skepticism note on contemporary poetry, which was in 1919, found that De La Mare's Peacock Pie contains some of the most delightful works he has ever done. The world of childhood, however, is only a facet of De La Mare's work. So he's often compared with Thomas Hardy and William Blake, right? So let's get started with the poem, right? Before we, go ahead with the poem, before I read it out to you and explain it to you, let's understand that the this particular poem, which was published in 1912 as the title, and is of his selection, his second selection of poetry. It remains one of his most famous pieces of writing and reflects the author's fascination with mystery and the supernatural. The poem tells the story of an unnamed traveler approaching an abandoned house which is seemingly inhabited by a ghost, but leaves the reader with many questions, right? So, like I have always maintained, that most of the poems are supposed to be metaphysical. This is also one of them, right? So, let's understand a little bit about the summary before we get into the detail. So, what really happens is that, as I said, that there's an unnamed figure, who's known as a traveler. He knocks on the door of a house in a moonlit night, and he asks if there is anybody there. So the traveler's horse is grazing in the quiet forest while the traveler waits for a response. There are birds flying out of a small tower in the house, which makes it understandable that it is basically abandoned, right? The traveler knocks again and again and more forcefully, and he repeats his questions. He says, no, you see, no one comes down from the house to meet him, however. No one even leans out of the window to see who is actually there. So he stands in place, puzzled by the lack of an answer. Inside the house is a group of ghost beings, you see. These listeners stand in the moonlight, and they are, listening to that human voice coming from outside. Some of them are crowding on the staircase onto which the moonlight streaks fall, right? So, and they are quite disturbed by the sound of the traveler's lonely voice, right? So I would say the traveler is a little, he has a sense of a strange presence in the silence, and that meets his questions. His horse is undisturbed and continues to graze in the dark, of the forest. And the sky above is full of stars and obscured by trees. So the traveler suddenly beats on the door once again, even more loudly than before, and he calls out, asking whoever is listening to pass on a message that no one answered him when he came to the house, but he kept his promise. So these listeners, they don't make any motion of response to this. The traveler's words, they reverberate through the dark, empty house, coming from the only living person around. The phantom listeners, they hear him jump up onto the horse, and then the horse goes away, right? So basically, this is what we get as the summary of the poem, right? So let us understand this particular poem a little more in detail, right? We must go through the poem a little more in detail. What I'll do is I'll read out this entire poem to you, and then we can actually go ahead and understand it line by line, right? So let's get started with this. Now, children, in this particular poem, you must have already come to know that there is this traveler, right? He comes and he is, you see, he's actually met by nobody, right? And why I say that this is a kind of a metaphysical poem, simply because we have a lot of queries in this. Now, children, let us understand that when we are talking about, this being a metaphysical poem, and we trying to understand that what really is it that we try to get from this poem, what could be the theme of this poem. Like I have always maintained that there has to be a theme for every poem, right? So here again, there has to be a theme for this particular poem as well, right? So what is it that you get? If we talk of the theme, the first and foremost theme of this particular poem is that it is loneliness, right? We have loneliness as the theme of this particular poem, right? And of course, one would say that we're talking about some supernatural and mysterious beings, right? Yeah, of course, that would be there, right? So let's understand that in this particular poem, we have, "Is there anybody there?" said the traveler, knocking on the moonlit door, and his horse in the silence champed the grass of the forest ferny floor, and a bird flew up out of the turret above the traveller's head, and he smote upon the door again a second time. "Is there anybody there?" So, what do you get? That there is a traveler, he is asking that, is there anybody there? Is there anybody who, who could answer him? So he's knocking on the moonlit door. So we understand that it is actually night, and he's knocking on the door, right? And he doesn't have any response to his knocking on the door. Nobody actually, goes ahead and answers him. The forest ferny floor means that it's a grassy floor. Obviously, when there is a forest, the floor will have to be grassy, right? And turret is the tunnel up. If you would recollect that there are many houses where you have, a chimney which is made of brick, right? So there is a tunnel, or let's say the chimney, from which the bird flew out and goes right above his head, right? And he knocks again the second time. Is there anybody there? Yet again, we have no reply. But no one descended to the traveler, no head from the leaf fringed sill leaned over and looked into his grey eyes, where he stood perplexed and still. But only a host of phantom listeners that dwelt in the lone house then stood listening in the quiet of the moonlight to that voice from the world of men. Now, in this particular, in these particular lines, we can very well understand that actually, you see, there is nobody who's answering. No one at all was answering, and he kept knocking on the door. There was nobody who actually leaned out of the window, on that the windowsill. And well, children's sill is actually, you know, a flat surface which is made, from where you can actually, hold the entire window, right? So from there, nobody actually looked out, and nobody even answered him. So he was standing there all perplexed, all, like in a state of dilemma that what is actually happening? Why isn't anybody answering? And who was actually there? Only a host of phantoms. When I talk of phantoms, I mean ghost. So, which means that this particular house was once upon a time actually, having a lot of people living there, and now there was nobody living there, right? And these ghosts, now they were the occupants of that particular house, right? And they were standing there listening in the moonlight to that only voice of a human being, because the rest, they were all who? Basically ghost, right? Stood thronging the faint moonbeams on the dark stair that goes down to the empty hall, harking in an air stirred and shaken by the lonely traveller's call. And he felt in his heart their strangeness, their stillness, answering his cry, while his horse moved, cropping the dark turf neath the starred and leafy sky. So basically, what happens? That over there was nobody who was answering, and the they were actually, you can well visualize that there's a staircase coming down, and on that staircase there was, moonlight lighting that particular dark, that staircase. And the phantoms, they were actually, standing on that staircase and listening to him, right? And on the other hand, you have a scene where the horse is busy, going, he's actually cropping means that it's actually cutting off the entire grass, right? So he's actually doing that, and then there was nobody who was answering, because it was, a total stillness around in that area. So while, the horse is eating the grass, you can imagine, there's a well, lit night, which is a moonlit night, and there are stars sprinkled all over the sky, and below you have one horse who is eating the grass, and this particular man, he is standing, he's perplexed, he's knocking on the door, nobody's answering. And it's as if there are ghosts inside the house. They are just standing there and listening to him. So this is what it is. And then, for he suddenly smote on the door even louder and lifted his head. Tell them I came, and no one answered. That I kept my word, he said. Nevertheless, stir made the listeners, though every word he spake fell echoing through the shadows of the still house, shadowness of the still house, from the above man left awake. So, Smart is like, knocking again on the door, and he was even a little louder this time. And what happens that he lifted his head and he spoke a little louder, saying that just tell them that I came, and nobody answered. That I had kept my word, I had kept my promise. So, with this particular line, we can well believe, we can well understand that there was actually, some there was some connection with him and the people who were living in that particular house, right? There was supposed to be some connection there, and at the same time, when he says this, he's looking up, still with the hope that actually there would be someone who would, look out and listen to him. So there's nobody actually looking out, nobody actually answering, and he just goes ahead speaking, and his voice is so loud that it echoes in the darkness, in that particular, it's as if he's standing there and speaking. Actually, children, if you are, standing in a forest and you are speaking a little loud, if there is stillness, definitely your voice will resound, right? So this is what happens, right? So the last few lines, the last four lines are, A, they heard his foot upon the stirrup, and the sound of iron on stone, and how the silence surged softly backward when the plunging hoofs were gone. So, what happens really is that we get to know that now again this particular traveler, he, gets up on his horse again, and he starts riding away. Why we say iron on stone is because the uh, shoe of the horse is basically made of iron, right? And there must have been, a stone pavement outside the house, right? So this is what actually happens, that we have, the sound of hooves coming and going, it's listened by these phantoms inside the house, right? And then there is again a kind of silence, right? So this is basically what we have as uh, the poem. Now, when we listen to this poem, when we get the summary, we of course know that it's all about being lonely. It's all about, uh, imagination. And actually, when you read this particular poem, you can imagine the entire scene, that there is, darkness. There is just one, little light coming through the trees, falling on this particular house. There is a bird which flies out of the, uh, you know, the tunnel, the house. So what would be one of the literary devices? Obviously, one of your particular literary device would be imagery, right? So, what is it? We have imagery, we have anaphora, we have enjambment, we also have repetition, right? So, basically, we have these particular literary devices. Throughout the listeners, this particular poem by Walt De La Mare, he uses several different literary devices. These, these of course, like I said, are not just limited to enjambment, anaphora, and imagery. Of course, the latter is one of the most important devices that's used in the poem. It can be seen throughout as the poet describes the landscape and the traveler's experiences and everything, like I just said about imagery, right? We're actually talking about imagery here. So, enjambment is seen through the transition between lines. For example, between line 10 and 11, anaphora is again another formal device that's seen through the repetition of words at the beginning of lines, for example, and, right? So, in lines 5 and 7, as well as 34 and 35. So, basically, we have these particular literary devices which are there in this particular poem, right? So, that will be all. Thank you so very much for being there. Thank you. Have a wonderful day. Bye bye.